Hey, what's up? It's Jesko again from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. So let's talk about bass trapping, and in particular, bang for the buck, right? Is there a cheap solution to bass trapping, or rather, what is the cheapest solution for bass trapping? But let me burst that bubble right away. There is no cheap solution to low-end control in home studios or any other studios for that matter, at least not in the real sense of the word. But there is obviously a good kind of price performance option if you weigh all the criteria against each other. So there's definitely a solution that gives you good performance, where the use of space is acceptable, where the price isn't too high, and perhaps most importantly, it's actually doable, as in the complexity of actually implementing it in your room isn't too large. So spoiler alert, if you haven't guessed it already, I'm talking about a porous absorber bass trap with roughly 6 to 8 inches core depth. Yeah, that's something between 16 to 20 centimeters of material. Yeah, and if you use that right in your room and you pick the right materials, that, in my opinion, will give you the best price performance. But it's often not quite clear why that is with all the different options out there. And so that's what I want to show you in this video. I'm going to go through all the different types of low-end control options that you have for your typical home studio, compare them, and just show you why porous absorbers always win out when we try and treat the low end in our studios. Now, before I get into that, all the options I'm going to show you and many more I've collected into my free complete guide to bass traps and bass trapping. This is basically sort of an encyclopedia of all the different bass trap designs that you can find out there, both DIY and off the shelf. Yeah, so they're all in there. Obviously porous absorber bass traps, but also Helmholtz resonators, membrane traps, active traps, tube traps, and all combinations of those. And I've laid them out in a way for you to quickly understand what they do, how they work, how you can actually identify what type of bass trap you're looking at if you're looking at different kind of options online, but also how to correctly use them, how many you would actually need to get an effect, and how to place them correctly in your room. Yeah, so that's all laid out in my complete guide to bass traps and bass trapping that you can download for free at the link in the description. All right, coming back to the question of the cheapest type of low-end control for a home studio, I want to just quickly define what I mean by low-end control first, because that's gonna impact how we actually judge all the different options. And for a home studio, what I generally mean by that is, first of all the frequencies below about 150 hertz. So the first type of effect that you'll find in that frequency range, and that really dominates the response in that range, are standing waves. This is basically the resonances of the room. You can kind of imagine this like the ringing of a bell. Yeah, so the room literally starts ringing, and because of that we have both frequency effects, the typical peaks and dips that we've seen in measurements, and also time related effects. So there's a decay associated with these standing waves. So because these standing waves occupy potentially the entire range under 150 hertz, I'm going to call this kind of broadband. Yeah, so at least in the range that we're looking at, this is a broadband problem. The next problem that you also have to deal with in the low end is speaker boundary effects, speaker boundary interference, also called speaker boundary interference response, SBIR. Yeah? This is a reflection effect. It's usually characterized by a kind of a gentle boost in the frequency response, followed by a very narrow, very steep dip. But this is much narrower in response in terms of covering that frequency range. And funnily enough, it also only shows up in frequency. So this is not really a time-related effect, although obviously it's caused by the interference of a delayed version of the signal that reflects back to the speaker. And then third, we also have your typical mirror point reflections, specular reflections. Yeah, these tend to be higher up in frequency, but depending on the situation, they can also show up in the kind of up down to about 100 hertz region. These also show up in both time and frequency, although they are usually not as drastic as the other two, at least when we're looking at this low frequency range. Okay, so those are the main effects that we have to deal with when we're talking about low-end control. And any solution, ideally, should cover all of these, should be able to handle all of these. Yeah, so that's what I'm going to be using as the criteria when I'm judging the different options. So as the good nerd that I am, I prepared a table for us. Yeah, just quickly before I show that to you, remember that the way I'm rating this is purely for home studios, and even more particular if you're DIYing your acoustics, if you're doing things yourself. Yeah, you're not a professional acoustician. Yes, you've read some subject matter, you know about the general ideas, but you're not an expert in the field, and that affects how you actually implement these solutions or how easy they are to implement in many ways. So here's that table. Yeah, the 5 different types of treatment that we're going to be looking at that would typically pop up when we're talking about low-end control are room correction software, obviously SonarWorks and its cousins. We have active bass traps, active bass absorbers. The most well-known one these days is probably the PSI Ava. We've got resonance traps, both Helmholtz and membrane traps. And then finally, we've got porous absorber bass traps. And the 4 criteria I'm judging them against are the price. How expensive is it actually to implement these solutions? The effectiveness, how good are they at covering that entire range below 150 hertz and the individual effects that pop up within that range? Then there's the question of use of space, because typically in a home studio, we're working out of a small room. So we don't want them to use up too much space, or we want to keep the room usable. Yeah? And then the complexity. So that means both in terms of building the device, if you're building it yourself, but also setting it up and actually making it function as intended. So let's start by just looking at the price of each of these solutions. Yeah, room correction software. You can buy that. It's pretty cheap, a couple of $100, and you're in the game. Active bass absorbers. Now, the PSI Ava is a pretty expensive unit in the thousands of dollars. So I would judge that as high to very high. Talking about Helmholtz resonance traps, what's the price there? Well, if you buy them off the shelf, they're reasonably expensive. If you build them yourself, same thing, the material cost involved isn't that low. One thing to always keep in mind with this is that you don't just need one of these units. If we're trying to cover the entire range below 150 hertz, we're talking about multiple units, possibly more than 10 of these, depending on how you use them to cover that range. And we'll talk about that again when we're looking at the effectiveness. Obviously, active bass traps are probably the best here because you only need 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe. Yeah, at least for the PSI Ava, as far as I understand. Membrane resonance traps, same as with Helmholtz resonance traps, you need the same amount. So I'm just going to say 4 per kind of frequency band. If we're trying to cover that 150 hertz range, we can probably split that up into about 3 bands, each of which will need at least 4 of these to cover that band. And then when we're talking about porous absorber bass traps, well, the price is flexible depending on how many you put in your room. But with porous absorber bass traps, it's very much a game of quantity over quality. And so you need quite a few of them. And in that case, the price also tends to go up. And we're probably looking at somewhere in the low thousands of dollars if you want to treat the entire room properly. Now let's look at effectiveness. How well do they actually work to treat these 3 problem types, these 3 acoustic effects in that range? So with room correction software, the problem is that it's really just EQ. It can help with the balance of things, but definitely not with the time aspect. That is crucial to damping standing waves. Yeah, so basically room correction software is not effective against standing waves. It's also marginally effective at actually balancing out standing wave issues, or even the other effects, yeah, so speaker boundary interference related effects on the frequency response, or reflection-based effects. Because of the nature of these effects, there are certain things you just cannot EQ properly. Yeah, so I would even say it basically doesn't work properly, especially in an empty room, to treat the low end. It helps, but it's not a proper solution. Yeah, I've put room correction software in here because many of you will probably think about that as part of the solution of treating the low end, or jump to that as a first option because it's so cheap. But when we're looking at it purely as a solution for the low end, it's not that great. Yeah, it has its place in the treatment process, but it is not a good solution on its own to treat the low end. So then, how is the effectiveness of active bass absorbers? Yeah, I put a question mark here because it's actually pretty difficult to judge. When we're thinking about the PSI Ava, I think that it's a great company. Speakers are great. I have zero criticism. Yeah, but from what I've seen so far, it doesn't seem to be that effective for the price. There might be, I've not tested it myself, so I can't say that from personal experience. This is purely from people sending me info that when they've tried it, and then other publicly available information on the internet. And from that, it doesn't seem to work all that great. And again, there might be a lot of reasons why that is. One of them might just be setting it up properly, yeah, positioning it properly in the room. There are many reasons why it might not work in the examples that I've seen, but I haven't seen a single example where it worked very well. Yeah, so for me right now, there's a big question mark here. So then Helmholtz resonance traps. Why did I put the effectiveness at low? Well, the problem with Helmholtz resonance traps is that they have a very, very narrow queue. So basically, it's an extremely targeted treatment. It only works in an extremely narrow band. And because we're trying to cover the entire range below 150 hertz, Helmholtz resonance traps are just not the right tool for the job. They work extremely well if correctly built, correctly placed, and so on, but only for the intended purpose. And so think about this more like a sniper rifle than a shotgun. Yeah, this is a targeted treatment for a very particular problem. But as a broad solution for the entire low end, it basically doesn't work. Membrane resonant traps are a little different. Yeah, their effectiveness is actually very high, again, if built properly, positioned properly, but I'll come to that in a second. But they work across a much broader range, depending on how they're built. And if you combine differently tuned membrane traps, you can very effectively cover the entire low end. And they also work for all the three types of effects that we're trying to treat. Then porous absorbers. Why are they so effective? Or why are they kind of medium to highly effective? Well, the problem is that it's difficult to reach the lowest of the low frequencies with porous absorbers. It's possible, but you need very, very deep absorption. And even then, membrane traps work better, as in they are still more effective at actually damping the ringing of those standing waves, which again is kind of the main problem that we're dealing with. But if you're willing to sacrifice that you're not treating the lowest of the low frequencies, you can still get pretty low, and they work very well for that. On top of that, they're obviously broadband, so they will work for any of the problems, of the three problems that we typically encounter in the low end. That's what makes them very effective, or medium to highly effective for a home studio. Now let's talk about the use of space. Obviously, room correction software doesn't need any space at all. So the use of space is kind of a no-brainer here. It doesn't use any space. Active bass absorbers. I mentioned it already. You probably need 1, 2, 3, 4 of them. Yeah, so in terms of the actual units, they don't need much space. But from what I gathered from all the information I've seen so far, they are very sensitive to where you place them. And so that actually makes their use of space somewhat tricky. Yeah, it could be more complicated, as we'll see with Helmholtz or membrane traps, but it's definitely not easy. So that's why I've judged it as kind of medium difficulty or medium use of space, sorry. Helmholtz resonance traps, on the other hand, are extremely sensitive to placement. And you also need more units than you'd probably think, yeah, which makes their use of space medium to high in the sense that you have to compromise on how you use the room, because these traps need to go where they go or they won't work. The same is true for membrane resonance traps. Yeah, it's a little easier with these, but still very difficult, still very sensitive to placement. And you also need way more coverage, surface area coverage of these membrane traps than you might think. Yeah, so we're still talking a substantial amount of wall surface covered with these membrane traps if you want to cover the entire low end. It's still the same with porous absorbers though, except that they're not that sensitive to placement. Yeah, they are a little sensitive to placement, but not nearly as much. Yeah, and with our typical corner placement of porous absorber bass traps, we can reliably cover pretty much the entire low end, at least put something in the path of these standing waves without really thinking about it too much. Yeah, the corners are also just really useful because it's not space that we tend to use that much. It's not the most premium space in a small room. And obviously if we go under the ceiling, that's usually space that is always free. Yeah. So that's why, again, I've marked this as kind of medium to high use of space. It also depends on how many bass traps you put in your room. Yeah. Again, I would assume here that we're trying to cover the entire low end. We're trying to clean that up entirely. And for that, you need a substantial amount of panels. Yeah, so we're talking 10, 20, 30 of your standard porous absorber bass traps at least. So now let's talk about complexity. How easy is it to actually implement any of these solutions? Room correction software, well, complexity is pretty low. Yeah, you go through the process of measuring with the software and it does the rest for you. Active bass absorbers, well, you buy them off the shelf. As far as I understand, you have to find the right spot, but apart from that, you just switch them on. And so there, the complexity is somewhere in the low to medium range. Helmholtz resonance traps. Either you buy them ready-made, and there aren't too many good options for Helmholtz resonance traps if you buy them ready-made. That at least means you don't have to deal with the construction, which is a very difficult problem. But you still need to tune it. You still need to position it properly. And you need to figure out if it's actually dealing or it's actually solving a particular problem. And all that makes the complexity very high. Yeah? Helmholtz resonance traps are extremely difficult to implement. And if you haven't done this hundreds of times potentially, it is an iterative process that will take you a long time of experimentation, of trial and error to figure it out. Same goes for membrane resonance traps. There are a lot more options to buy them off the shelf. But if you don't do that and if you build them yourself, there are so many pitfalls to fall into. I won't even get into it. Yeah? But just to name a few, just the type of membrane that you're choosing makes a huge difference. How you mount the membrane makes a huge difference. The materials for the box. So the complexity of tuning this thing, building this thing, tuning this thing, making sure it actually works is extremely high. And then just like with the Helmholtz resonance traps, you need to actually make sure that they work as intended, which is very much an iterative process. And if you haven't done this a few times before and you've gained some experience, the first time will most likely not work. Yeah, so I've marked this as very high complexity because as a DIYer in a home studio, chances are it will fail, basically. But porous absorbers, the complexity is low. Well, I've marked it as medium. I would probably even say low to medium. Yeah. Yes, you have to find the right material and you need to build them potentially, unless you buy them off the shelf, obviously. But that is reasonably easy. And then again, in terms of using them in your room, they will basically work anywhere you put them. Yeah. There are strategies to effectively using these traps. They are somewhat sensitive to placement in terms of controlling the low end, but as a general rule, the more of them you have in the room, the better it's going to work. It is almost that simple. Yeah. So that's how I've judged these different options. Let's just kind of narrow it down now why the porous absorber base trap is the best option here, if you can't tell already. Yeah. Let's rule out the ones that basically don't work. Room correction software is basically not a solution for solving these low-end problems. I would also say that Helmholtz resonance traps are not a solution to solve these problems. The active base trap still needs to prove itself, but it is expensive. And considering that we don't know at this point how well it works, I'm going to have to rule it out. I can't recommend that you start treating your low end by buying active base traps. Not at this point. So then we were left with membrane traps and porous traps. And here the difference pretty much just lies in price. Membrane traps are just more expensive, and the complexity. Yeah, the fact that membrane traps are so difficult to implement in a room basically rules them out for DIY and home studio purposes. And that's why we're always left with the porous absorber base traps. If you look at all the different criteria that go into actually functionally controlling the low end in a home studio, porous absorbers always win out. Yeah, that's the reality of dealing with the low end in a home studio. It's not going to be cheap, but it is still going to be the best price performance that you can get, considering all the options out there. So I hope that shows you that there isn't really a cheap option to control the low end. But by judging the different criteria of what we actually need to treat the low end in a home studio, we can still come up, or we can still find a solution that works the best considering all these different criteria. And with that consideration, porous absorber base traps always come out on top. That's just how it is. All right, I hope you enjoyed watching this video. Let's get back to learning to trust our ears and having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.